The ocean is endless. It swallows sound, memory, and men. And in December 1941, as the smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, another storm was gathering, this time over a tiny crescent of sand in the middle of the Pacific, Wake Island, a name unknown to most Americans, no more than a dot on a map, a scrap of coral surrounded by infinite blue. Yet here, on this forgotten outpost, a handful of Marines, sailors, and civilian workers would be thrust into the front lines of history. Outnumbered, outgunned, abandoned by the world, they would face the rising empire of Japan with nothing but grit, steel, and defiance. For 16 days, the island became more than a battlefield. It became a singular place where courage met despair, where sacrifice echoed against the roar of the sea. This is the story of Wake Island, America's defiant stand. Part 1. The Island at Dawn. The Pacific Ocean stretches endless and unforgiving, a world of blue that swallows men and machines alike. In December 1941, as the fires of Pearl Harbor still smoldered, and the Pacific Fleet reeled from a stunning blow, another battle was already brewing far across the ocean on a coral atoll, no bigger than a speck of dust on a map. Wake Island. It was here, on this remote and windswept fortress of sand, that a small garrison of Marines, sailors, and civilians would face the full weight of the Japanese Empire. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and forgotten by the tides of war. Yet, for 2 desperate weeks, they would hold the line. This is the story of Wake Island at dawn, the moment when shadows lengthened and the quiet before the storm turned into the roar of war. Wake Island was not much to look at, a crescent-shaped atoll of coral and sand, with 3 islets forming a lagoon. On maps, it was nothing more than a dot between Midway and Guam, a lonely speck almost equidistant between Hawaii and Japan. To the United States Navy, however, it was a stepping stone, a potential airbase from which long-range patrol planes could cover the vast Pacific. In 1941, the Navy had stationed 449 Marines of the 1st Defense Battalion, supported by about 1,200 civilian contractors from the Morison Company, tasked with building the island into a fortress, runways, gun batteries, and a seaplane base. It was a work in progress, and by December, much remained unfinished. But the men on Wake worked with urgency, never knowing that their labor would soon become their battlefield. On December 7, 1941, as morning light rose over the island, news trickled across the Pacific wires. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The Marines gathered round radios, straining to hear the fragmented reports, their faces hardening with each word. For them, there would be no disbelief, no distance from the fight. They knew at once what this meant. If Japan had struck Hawaii, Wake Island was next. Captain Henry Elrod of the Marine Corps Fighter Squadron, VMF 211, checked his handful of Grumman F-4F Wildcats, just 12 aircraft in total. They were sturdy planes, but the odds were hopeless if Japan chose to strike with the might of its air force. Still, Elrod and his men prepared. Around the gun emplacements, Marines loaded shells into the 5-inch coastal guns, relics from World War I, but still deadly if given the chance. At the command post, Major James P.S. Devereux, the Marine garrison commander, issued calm orders. "We will defend this island," he told his men. They were few, but they were determined. The first strike came at noon on December 8, 1941, December 7th in Hawaii, but already the following day on Wake, due to the international dateline, Japanese bombers roared out of the sky. 36 twin-engine Mitsubishi G3M Nell bombers launched from bases in the Marshall Islands. They descended upon Wake like shadows, engines screaming, bombs whistling. There was no warning. The Marines' radar had not yet been installed. In a matter of minutes, the runways were shredded. Fuel storage tanks exploded in fireballs, and 7 of the 12 Wildcats were destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to take off. The civilian contractors, caught in the open, were cut down by shrapnel and flame. 30 men lay dead in the sand, dozens more wounded. When the smoke cleared, Wake Island was already bleeding. Yet the men refused to break. Elrod and his surviving pilots scrambled their remaining fighters, keeping them hidden in camouflaged revetments, to be used only when the enemy returned. The Marines dug deeper trenches, fortified gun positions, and braced themselves. The civilians, too, took up arms. Though many had come only to build runways and barracks, they were now thrust into war. "We had no choice," one contractor later said. "It was fight or die." For days, Japanese bombers returned, pounding the island with relentless fury. Each time, the defenders endured, repairing what they could, fighting fires, burying their dead. Elrod's wildcats rose when they could, darting into the sky to meet the bombers head-on. Against impossible odds, they fought with defiance. In one encounter, Elrod shot down 2 bombers, sending them plunging into the sea. He became a symbol of resistance, his courage lifting the spirits of the men huddled in the sand below. Meanwhile, in Japan's high command, Wake Island was considered a small but necessary target. The plan was simple: seize it quickly, establish a forward base, and further isolate American forces across the Pacific. To this task, the Imperial Navy dispatched a landing force of 500 troops, escorted by destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. The Japanese expected an easy victory. After all, what could a few hundred Marines do against the might of the Empire? The answer would soon shock them. On December 11th, the horizon darkened with the silhouettes of Japanese warships, the first invasion attempt. As dawn broke, the Marines held their fire, waiting, watching the enemy ships draw closer. The order came: commence firing. From concealed positions, the coastal guns roared to life. 5-inch shells screamed across the water, striking Japanese destroyers with brutal accuracy. The destroyer Eliot was hit squarely, exploding in a fireball that sent it to the bottom within minutes. The first Japanese warship sunk by American forces in World War II. Another destroyer, Kisaragi, was struck by bombs from the remaining Wildcats, its depth charges igniting in a massive explosion. It too slipped beneath the waves. The Japanese, stunned by the ferocity of the defense, withdrew in disarray. For the first time in the Pacific War, American defenders had turned back a Japanese invasion. The men of Wake Island cheered, their spirits lifted by the impossible victory. Radio reports of the battle carried across the Pacific, reaching Pearl Harbor and Washington. In a war filled with defeats and retreats, Wake Island became a beacon of hope. The press called it the Alamo of the Pacific, and the nation clung to the story of defiance. Yet the men on the island knew the truth. Their supplies were dwindling, their planes too few, and Japan would not give up so easily. The days that followed were a test of endurance. Bombs fell daily, each raid chipping away at defenses, killing more men and reducing the island to rubble. The civilians worked tirelessly to repair the airstrip, even under fire, while Marines held their posts in the blistering sun. Major Devereux wrote in his diary of the strain, the exhaustion, and the unbroken resolve of his men. Captain Elrod, now hailed as a hero, continued to fly until his final mission, strafing Japanese ships to buy time for his comrades. By mid-December, the defenders knew their time was running out. Reinforcements had been promised, but the Pacific was wide, and the US Navy was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The men on Wake listened to static-filled radios, hoping for news of relief, but none came. Instead, they heard rumors of larger Japanese fleets massing for another assault. The enemy would return, stronger, determined to finish what had begun. Yet on Wake Island, the men prepared anyway. With rifles cleaned, guns loaded, and trenches dug deeper, they braced for the storm to come. They were tired, hungry, and battered, but they would not surrender. In the coral dust and burning wreckage, the garrison of Wake stood ready, knowing that the next dawn could bring their end. For in December 1941, as empires clashed and oceans burned, Wake Island became more than a speck of coral. It became a symbol of defiance, of men who fought against the impossible, of courage carved into sand and stone. And as the Pacific War deepened, the defenders of Wake would etch their story into history not as victims, but as warriors who refused to bow. Part 2: The Siege. The sun had barely risen over the flat horizon of the Pacific when the defenders of Wake Island first heard it, a low, growing hum, like a swarm of bees gathering beyond the edge of the world. The sound thickened, multiplied, until the entire sky trembled, and then, like thunderclouds breaking open, they appeared, Japanese bombers flying in neat formations, glinting in the harsh morning light. It was December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. For most of America, the shock of war was still sinking in, but for Wake, there was no time for grief, no time to mourn the burning battleships of Hawaii. War was here. The first bombs fell with devastating precision. Japanese pilots, trained to strike with ruthless efficiency, targeted Wake's runways, fuel supplies, and aircraft. Within minutes, most of Wake's precious few Wildcat fighter planes on Lee-12 had been assigned to defend the island were reduced to smoking wrecks on the ground. The airfield itself was scarred with craters, its men scrambling to put out fires, to dig wounded comrades from beneath collapsed shelters. For the men of Wake, this was a brutal introduction. The enemy had chosen their moment well. Wake was isolated, its defenders cut off from reinforcements, its waters patrolled by Japanese ships. What had begun as a sleepy Pacific outpost now stood in the crosshairs of the rising empire. But what the Japanese could not know, what they could not calculate with bombs and blueprints, was the iron resolve of the men who lived and bled on that coral atoll. The first waves, the bombers returned again and again. Day after day, the island shook beneath the onslaught. The Marines dug trenches, reinforced gun pits, and prayed that their few anti-aircraft guns could hold off the sky. At night, as the fires of destruction smoldered, the men lay awake listening to the silence between waves, knowing another attack would come with the dawn. But even amid the chaos, courage flared. The surviving Wildcats, repaired by sheer determination, launched into the sky when they could, intercepting bombers, dogfighting against overwhelming numbers. These pilots knew the odds fuel and spare parts were scarce, ammunition was limited, and there would be no reinforcements, but they flew anyway, because if they did not, the island would die even faster. And then came the sea. On December 11th, only 3 days after the first bombs, the Japanese fleet moved in for the kill. Their plan was simple: land troops, seize the airfield, and raise the rising sun flag over Wake. To the Japanese, this should have been easy. Wake was tiny, the garrison small, the defenses fragile. But what awaited them was something they had not anticipated: the counterattack. In the early hours, Japanese destroyers and cruisers closed in on Wake, guns blazing, their troops ready to storm the beaches. But from the island's battered gun emplacements, the Marines responded with fire of their own. Heavy coastal defense guns, manned by exhausted but determined crews, roared to life. The sea itself seemed to convulse as shells found their mark. One destroyer, the Eliot, was struck and torn apart, sinking beneath the waves in a violent explosion. Another, the Kisaragi, was hit by airstrikes from the last surviving U.S. Wildcats, her ammunition stores detonating in a massive fireball that sent debris raining across the sea. Japanese sailors screamed as their ship was consumed, and survivors clawed desperately at the water before disappearing beneath the waves. It was a stunning reversal. The Japanese had underestimated the defenders of Wake. For the first time in the war, a Japanese invasion force was repelled. The defenders, outnumbered, undersupplied, stranded, had struck back, sinking enemy warships and forcing the fleet to retreat. Across the Pacific, as word spread, Wake Island became a symbol of defiance, a tiny spark of hope against the darkness, a symbol of defiance. In Washington, in Pearl Harbor, and across a shocked America, the defense of Wake was a rallying cry. Newspapers printed bold headlines: "Wake Island holds." Radio broadcasts praised the Marines and civilians alike, painting them as heroes standing against impossible odds. For a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor, battered and bleeding. Wake was proof that the enemy could be resisted, that the rising sun was not invincible. But for the men on the island, there was no time to bask in glory. They were still trapped, surrounded by a relentless enemy that had tasted humiliation and would not forget it. Japanese pride demanded revenge. More ships were coming, more bombers would return, and the defenders knew reinforcements from the US Navy, though promised, might never arrive in time. The long nights, after the victory of December 11th, Wake's men braced for the storm to come. They rebuilt fortifications, salvaged what they could from the wreckage, and counted their dwindling supplies. Ammunition was precious, food and water were limited. The island, though defiant, was bleeding slowly. At night, the men would sit in silence, listening to the sea and the occasional distant thrum of engines. They wrote letters they knew might never be delivered, clutched photographs of families thousands of miles away, and shared whispered promises to hold the line no matter the cost. For some, it was faith in God. For others, faith in the core. But all knew that Wake Island was no longer just a dot on a map. It was their world, their fate, their stand. The Japanese return. On December 23rd, after nearly 2 weeks of relentless siege, the Japanese returned with overwhelming force. Carriers dispatched fresh waves of bombers, hammering the island until it seemed more rubble than sand. Warships encircled the atoll, pouring shells onto every defensive position. This time, they came prepared, their pride stung by the earlier defeat. The defenders fought with every ounce of strength left in them. Coastal guns fired until their barrels glowed red, until ammunition ran dry. The few remaining wildcats took to the skies one last time, diving into enemy formations with reckless abandon, their pilots knowing each flight might be their last. On the beaches, Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors alike picked up rifles, machine guns, anything that could fire, and met the landings head-on. But the weight of numbers was crushing. Japanese troops surged ashore, swarming through smoke and fire, bayonets gleaming. The defenders fell back, step by step, fighting room by room, trench by trench. Bodies littered the sand, blood-staining the turquoise waters that lapped against the coral reef. The last stand. In those final hours, Wake Island became a nightmare. Flames consumed buildings, gunfire rattled through the night, and the cries of the wounded echoed over the surf. Commanders gave orders to fight until the end, to resist until there was nothing left, and many did. Yet by dawn, the defenders could no longer hold. Ammunition was gone. Positions were overrun. The choice was death or capture. And so, with bitter hearts and broken bodies, the last survivors were forced to surrender. For the Japanese, Wake was finally theirs. For the Americans, it was a bitter loss. But even in defeat, the defenders of Wake had etched their names into history. They had held for 16 days against impossible odds. They had sunk Japanese warships, destroyed aircraft, and inflicted a wound on the pride of an empire. They had given America a story of defiance in its darkest hour. Legacy of the siege. The siege of Wake was more than a military engagement. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, of what men can endure when the world abandons them. The Marines, the sailors, the civilian contractors all fought as one, their lives bound together in the struggle for survival. Many would not live to see freedom again. Those taken prisoner faced years of brutal captivity, starvation, and execution. But their stand was remembered, their defiance immortalized in the annals of war. The Siege of Wake was not just about a battle on a coral atoll. It was about the spirit of resistance, about ordinary men, far from home, who refused to bow quietly to an empire. Part 3. The Last Stand. The night of December 22nd, 1941, was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the chest and suffocates hope. On Wake Island, the defenders knew the storm was coming. For nearly 2 weeks they had defied Japan-repelling landings, sinking ships, downing aircraft, but the price of defiance had been steep. Ammunition was low. Food and water were scarce, and exhaustion etched itself into every man's face. The men of Wake knew this night might be their last. All around the battered atoll, faint fires still smoldered from the most recent bombardment. Craters pockmarked the coral earth, fuel tanks burned in the distance, and shattered aircraft lay twisted in blackened heaps beside the runways. The men could smell the salt of the sea mingled with the acrid stench of cordite and smoke. Some sat quietly, clutching rifles, staring into the darkness. Others whispered prayers or scribbled hasty notes to families thousands of miles away, knowing those words might never reach their destination. And then, sometime after midnight, the silence broke. The distant thrum of engines came first slow, steady, unmistakable. The men held their breath. Soon the horizon bloomed with flashes of light as Japanese naval guns opened fire. The sea lit up with muzzle bursts, and the shells screamed overhead before crashing into the island in terrible concussions. The ground shook, sand sprayed in deadly clouds, and dugouts collapsed as the bombardment intensified. The final assault, the Japanese had returned in force. This time there would be no retreat. Their humiliation from December 11th, when the first invasion attempt had been repelled, demanded blood and victory. Admiral Kajioka had brought a powerful armada, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and the shadow of aircraft carriers that circled like vultures beyond sight. They had studied their enemy, learned from mistakes, and now unleashed overwhelming fire. Under the cover of the naval barrage, landing craft churned through the waves, carrying Japanese Marines armed with rifles, bayonets, and flamethrowers. The sea seemed to ripple with menace as the craft drew closer, their outlines lit by fire from burning fuel stores on the island. On shore, the defenders clung to their posts, teeth gritted, hearts pounding. They had fought before, and they would fight again. When the first wave of Japanese troops hit the beaches, Wake exploded in defiance. Marines fired rifles, machine guns, and anything that could still spit lead. Coastal defense guns, manned by exhausted crews, roared once more, hurling shells into the sea. Japanese soldiers fell into the surf, their cries drowned in the chaos. But the waves kept coming. The defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Civilians, contractors, and construction workers who had come to build an airfield now fought shoulder to shoulder with Marines, wielding rifles they barely knew how to use. Every man on Wake had become a soldier. Grenades arced through the night, machine guns rattled from sandbag nests, and bayonets clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The air was filled with smoke, blood, and screams. The collapse, but courage cannot outlast mathematics. The Japanese outnumbered the defenders 5-1. Their firepower was overwhelming, their waves endless. One by one, the American positions fell. Coastal guns were destroyed by direct hits, their crews torn apart, trenches filled with corpses as Japanese soldiers stormed through, cutting down defenders with bayonets. The few remaining wildcats, damaged and starved of fuel, could not take to the skies again. By dawn, the beaches were littered with bodies. The defenders were pushed back, deeper and deeper into the heart of the island. Ammunition ran low. Men scrounged through the dead for spare rounds, using captured Japanese rifles when their own ran empty. They fought on even when the battle was clearly lost, driven by nothing but the raw instinct to resist. Major James Devereux, commanding the Marines, and Commander Winfield Cunningham, the Navy officer in charge, tried to coordinate the last stand. Messages sent over radio crackled with desperation. Still holding but running out of everything, the Japanese pressed in from all sides, tightening the noose. By mid-morning, the realization settled like lead. Wake Island could no longer hold the order no one wanted. At 7 a.m. on December 23rd, Commander Cunningham gave the order that no American wanted to hear: surrender. The men had fought with unimaginable valor, but there was nothing left. To continue would mean total slaughter. White flags were raised, weapons lowered, and the echoes of gunfire faded into a terrible silence. For the survivors, relief was mixed with grief and shame. They had stood longer than anyone thought possible, but surrender left a bitter taste. They were prisoners now, their fates in enemy hands. The Japanese swarmed the island, rounding up exhausted, bloodied Americans. Many were beaten, some executed on the spot. The battle for Wake Island was over. 16 days of defiance had ended in chains. Fate of the defenders. The Japanese wasted no time in making the cost of defiance clear. Hundreds of American prisoners were forced into harsh captivity, shipped across the Pacific to prison camps in China and Japan. There, many endured years of forced labor, starvation, disease, and abuse. Some never returned home. Even darker was the fate of 98 civilian contractors who were not evacuated with the other prisoners. The Japanese forced them to remain on Wake, compelling them to labor for the empire. In October 1943, with the war turning against Japan and fearing an American attempt to retake the island, the Japanese executed all 98 in cold blood. Reflection on sacrifice. For Japan, the capture of Wake was a victory, but a costly one. Their pride had been wounded by the unexpected resistance, their fleet embarrassed by the sinking of warships during the first assault. For America, Wake became a rallying cry, proof that even in its darkest days, courage could shine through. The defenders of Wake Marines, sailors, and civilians alike became legends, their stand immortalized in headlines, films, and history books. Yet for the men who survived, the story was not one of glory, but of loss. They remembered the faces of comrades who would never return, the screams on the beaches, the smell of burning flesh. They carried those memories through captivity, through years of silence, and even after returning home. Wake Island was not just a battle, it was a scar etched into their souls. The legacy of Wake. Today, Wake Island stands as a lonely atoll in the Pacific, windswept and silent. But beneath its coral sands lie the echoes of December 1941, the ghosts of men who chose to fight against impossible odds. Their sacrifice was not in vain. In those desperate days, they gave America something it desperately needed: hope. Their story reminds us that history is not written only by the victors, but also by those who resisted with everything they had, even when defeat was certain. Wake Island was America's Thermopylae last stand against overwhelming force, a testament to courage in the face of annihilation. As we look back, we honor the defenders not just for their defiance, but for their humanity, their letters home, their whispered prayers, their unshakable brotherhood. Wake Island was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible of sacrifice. History often remembers victories, but it is in defeats that we see the true measure of men. The fall of Wake Island was a tragedy, yet within that tragedy lived a story of valor that inspired a nation and echoed across the generations. The men of Wake stood until they could stand no longer, and in their sacrifice, they gave America its first symbol of defiance in a war that would ultimately end in liberation. And so, as we close the story of Wake Island's last stand, we remember not only the loss, but the light born in those desperate days, a light that told the world, even in darkness, courage endures. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.